My name is Ilona Kickbusch. I'm the director of the Global Health Program at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and my field of research is the governance of global health. So we look at various dimensions of governance. On the one hand, particularly, of course, global health governance. That is, how do the global health institutions work? Where do they work? Where might they not fulfill their job? But we look beyond the global health institutions because we, of course, know that many health conditions are actually defined through the actions of other organizations, like the World Trade Organization, for example. So we also look at what we call global governance for health. That is, how do other institutions govern health, and how does that interface? And finally, we of course look at the national situation, because one of the big challenges is, are countries willing to concede some of their sovereignty in order to deal with global health challenges? And so we look at what we call governance for global health. That is, what do countries put in place? How do they take decisions at the national level in terms of what they negotiate at the global level? So it's that triangle of governance that we look at. Within the IPSP, I have been invited to be one of the lead authors in a chapter that presently is called Boundaries of Life. In our discussions, we felt that we might not want to stick with that title. So we're having very engaged discussions, how to approach that. We feel that the area we are looking at, which is of course very related to health in its broadest sense, is one of the areas where significant progress has been achieved over the last 50 years. And that actually what we are dealing with are the unintended consequences of some of this progress. People are living longer all around the world. There is new technology, but that technology does not only have positive impact. The technology itself leads to new social approaches to health and to medicine. And so those are issues that we are just looking at and discussing more today. And of course, one of my roles is to always keep an eye on the global dimensions, because the impact of globalization on health is very, very significant. Our participation in the panel is of course driven by the fact that we all feel social sciences are important. In the global health arena, we see very much that many of the problems are dominated by medical thinking, are dominated by technical solutions, and that very frequently the political and the social context is neglected. And we feel many global health initiatives and programs could possibly have been more successful if social and political factors had been taken into account. If you look at the recent Ebola epidemic, for example, one of the main criticisms is that community participation, values of the community knowledge was not taken into account. And many believe that the epidemic could have been handled better if one had done this from the very start. So we look what in our field of work we call determinants of health, which means what are social determinants of health, and a very important determinant there, of course, is social inequity. But another important determinant is education. Education is probably the most important determinant of health. But we also look at the political determinants of health. How does political action and political ideology influence decisions on health, private healthcare systems or public healthcare systems? And finally, increasingly, we look at commercial determinants of health. That is, how does a global market that pushes soft drinks and fast food and tobacco and alcohol, how does that impact on global health, people's behaviors, people's values and beliefs? Well, anybody who researches and works in a certain field hopes that there will be an impact. Impact, of course, means that people who take decisions will be reading such material and will take the results of research into account. So my hope would also be that the way our chapter is written and the way the whole project actually moves forward is that it reaches out to decision makers, and that the impact of social context and political approaches to such problems are better understood. And that's why the mix of disciplines that's brought together here is so important, because the social sciences and the humanities have so much to offer. And as was said yesterday, that is not only in the here and now, but we need to have a historical perspective. And for us in global health also, the historical perspective in relation to public health is absolutely critical, because the greatest advances in health were made for the whole of the population, not through individual treatment. It was better housing, better water, better food. And we face a very similar issue now in the developing countries, but it's also ideological, cultural decisions. One of the reasons we do not have better maternal health in the developing countries is that women are not valued, that their voice is not heard, and that therefore there are no policies that actually support their health. My most relevant work on thinking about social change has probably been in two areas. I used to work for the World Health Organization, and in that context I was responsible for a major policy document of the WHO. It is called the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. And over the last 25 years, that has had a significant impact in how we look at social change for health. It speaks particularly about community empowerment. It looks at the supportive environments for health, particularly the social dimensions. And also it speaks about what we call healthy public policy. That is, which kind of policies actually impact on health. So that policy document, which showed a new approach to public health, has had significant impact, so that now, for example, when we look at the obesity epidemic, we don't only look at people's behavior and what they eat, but we look at what we call an obesogenic environment. We look at issues like taxation of soft drinks and areas like that. Of course, it's not only this document that has led to such changes, but because it came from the WHO, it has contributed significantly to that debate. And that, of course, was based on a lot of social science research, the kind of research I also did before I joined the WHO. The other area is linked to governance, as I said earlier. In my work, I have developed those three dimensions of governance for health at the global and at the national level. And that way of looking at things and looking at political and social determinants is becoming something that is being used more consistently in the global health arena. And finally, I've just started work on health security. I'm very concerned at the very narrow approach to health security, and we are looking at how the Ebola outbreak, and I was part of an evaluation panel on WHO's response to that outbreak. So how the Ebola outbreak actually shows us that we cannot juxtapose a human rights approach to health and health care, of access to universal health services, and a health security approach which looks at the public health institutions that we need in order to keep people safe. In the past, this was looked at as a conflict between the North and the South, that northern countries want to protect their health against the dreadful threats from the South. And we have, at that point, already said if you go into an aeroplane, probably the more dangerous person is the tobacco executive in first class than the potential virus carrier in the back of the plane. But we also see that health security, of course, is something that's relevant to all countries. The neighboring countries in West Africa, like Mali, for example, were threatened. Senegal was threatened. So there is a need to see health security in the context of human security and social security and protection of people's right to be protected. And this is something we are working on right now, and which I hope will be debated consistently and frequently. Actually, I'd like to start the other way round, not from the most relevant social problem. I'd like to start out from the fact that in health, as I've said earlier, there has been this enormous achievement of not only increased life expectancy, but increased health expectancy. What is a problem is that our societies are not prepared for this. Our social institutions are not. Just think of, who will take care of elder people, for example. How will we resolve social security issues? How do we deal with health problems in old age? How do our health systems cope with chronic disease? So you have consequences of a major success, and we frequently forget the success part of that. But there's a dark side to this success also, and that is the uneven distribution. So we do see that health inequalities have not been reduced to the extent that we would have thought 20 or 30 years ago. Actually, in some countries, they are increasing again. If you think of Europe, the health consequences of austerity politics, for example, are very disconcerting. We also see that in some parts of Europe, there are still differences in life expectancy of 7 to 10 years between rich and poor people. And then, of course, we do have significant health inequalities between rich and poor countries, even though they are narrowing. But what we see is that the challenge is not so much rich and poor countries, it's actually the fact that the majority of poor people in the world live in the emerging economies. So as they develop, in quotes, the inequalities increase, and it is particularly in countries like India, China, that we see the most significant health inequalities that we need to address. So that's one set of problems very much linked to health. The other side of problems is the more institutional governance side of the problem that I mainly research on, and that is, how do you actually get countries to pool their sovereignty? How is it that in an age where many of the health problems and challenges are global, cross borders, that countries are still so protective of their right to decide everything on health? And we see the difficulty in getting countries to adopt international agreements in relation to health. At present, we have only two. We have the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and we have the international health regulations. But we have seen again in the Ebola epidemic that countries do not really adhere to the international health regulations. They have not followed up on their responsibilities. And therefore, there is a big challenge to actually be able to understand, first of all, why countries will not pool sovereignty in this very significant area that affects them, and how one could actually address this issue, which is getting more and more important as the threat of possible global epidemics, or pandemics as we call them, rises. And we were reasonably lucky, in quotes, with Ebola because it is difficult to transmit. But if we were to consider a new kind of flu epidemic, an airborne virus, then we would be in deep trouble, because the Ebola epidemic did show us that most countries, including very rich countries, are not well prepared and are not very willing to work together to actually address such a pandemic. So that is a really key challenge in our field as well. The impact of IPSP has been discussed in relation, of course, to other major global panels, both in the environment and in social areas. I think it can have an impact if it is able to put across its results in a way that appeals both to policymakers and to the international community as a whole, social movements, non-governmental organizations, parliamentarians, so that two things happen. That on the one hand, maybe there is a reconsideration of some of the policies that are out there, but also that there is a shift in mindset, how we understand our societies, how we understand social progress, that it is progress that relates to people's health and well-being, not necessarily the progress of economic indicators. So, that we understand better, if we are interested in social progress, better health and well-being of people, that in order to move such an agenda forward, we do need the social sciences and the humanities. And that hopefully would also have an impact on the way research is funded, on the extent to which social sciences and the humanities are included in concrete programs and projects. Again, Ebola is a very good example, whether the implementation teams included social sciences, anthropologists who would actually understand the cultural context and community meaning. So if the panel can help with that, on the one hand, a better understanding of the contribution of social sciences, the inclusion of social sciences, a different understanding of social progress perhaps, and a way forward that would define social progress in itself in a different way.